Well, thank you very much for inviting me, Julie. It's a pleasure to be with you. Today I'll be speaking about what makes Trinitarian Ontology new, what is the novelty of the Trinity, and how we can think of it new today. Where can we discover that which is new? Lacking the eyes of a child, we look upon the world under the shadow of its past. We can only see what happens in a way that conforms to the frame of what has already transpired. Yet in an increasing foreshortening of the mythic in the modern, it recalls only what has been known or held to be known from the passing threshold of our shared cultural imagination. No longer as before in crises of depression, war, and renewal, but rather in a capitulation to an already decided path of modernity, to the recycling of the symbolic reminders of youth as a spectacle of aged consumption. From cinema to streaming platforms, the cultural icons of past generations have been immortalized in a cyclical reproduction that offers to prolong all that is old at the expense of ever what could be new. This anxiety raises a higher philosophical question. What is the meaning of novelty? Were the new to be conceived as simply that which is different from the same, the difference were simply the other or negation of that sameness, then it would seem that, as we often hear in the works of Gilles Deleuze, Catherine Keller, and secular philosophers of difference, that novelty is but a virtual aspect of identical repetition. In a twist on Spinoza, it is, if the new is necessary, the necessity in novelty would appear to coincide in the infinite and eternal motion of one and the same substance. Were alternatively the new to be conceived of in a way that is so utterly different from all that had transpired in the past, it could not be recognized in the full narrative force of its sudden rupture, except, like in the absurdist theater of Samuel Beckett, as an incomprehensible anomaly that resists comprehension within myth, history, and all human experience. As in the sudden surprise turn of events that suddenly resolves a dramatic conflict, genuine novelty can be most expressly recognized as new when it not only breaks from, but also essentially restores that from which it breaks in the fullness of its essential purpose. Hence, in contrast to a by-do, it is not simply an unconditional event from which follows all set theoretic, mathematical, and or logical possibility, but rather the originary and singularly repeated event that is continuous with as it creates the conditions for all other events, whether those be in myth, history, and time, especially those which we find in pure formal thought. And in contrast to Gilles Deleuze, it is not a chaotic assemblage of flights of reflection from the actual to the virtual, but rather a discovery from within the nethermost abyss of the virtual, the symbolic and the aesthetic of the writing, that is, of the spiritual gospel, that collects the plenitude of virtuality as given from the oldest ground of originary possibility. Hence, as in Plato's Meno paradox, we can never discover that which is unknown unless, in a certain sense, it is already known. What then can we say is the novelty of Trinitarian Ontology? Initially, the answer seems to be this: nothing. For if the essence of God as Trinity is eternal, and the doctrine of the Trinity had been magisterially defined by the Catholic Church, then it seems nothing of the Trinity could ever genuinely come to be known as new. Since all that can be known comes to be known, and this process of coming to know is itself a momentary part of that by which it is known, the Trinity must be constituted by the surprise of this moment that is new. Since the process can be nothing but God, and the Trinity must be the source of its very own surprise. And if God creates to become incarnate in human flesh, this event recreates the world, and its historical development is not ever lost to, but rather continuous with the historical growth of Christianity. The oldest idea of God must be that which ever awaits to be discovered from the first and oldest beginning. I'm going to skip over the parts that are indented here. So if we'll flip to page 3, we'll continue. In a third way, beyond analytic and continental philosophy, the Bishop Aachen, Klaus Himmerl, had first recollected how the event-like character of Christian doctrine may be transformed, the speech of being, quote, from out of the heart of our faith, from the Christ event as it is read in a Trinitarian fashion, end quote. The uniqueness of the Christian Trinity resides precisely in this, its radical relationality. For the Nicene Cappadocian Christian orthodoxy affirms that being, or ousia, is a relation that is shared from the Son to the Father, from the Father and the Son with the Spirit, and by a free gift in the creation of all substances that are related from God as ultimately for their final end. It announces the ecstatic relations that may erupt from the metaxu, or in-between, of beings that connects all substances, things, and persons in pursuit of their originary source and final destiny. In double contrast to Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel and Martin Heidegger, it speaks of being neither in a fully indeterminate nor determinate sense, but only as it may be shaped as it is given in its being to give again, and to be itself that which is given as being. It is thus already shaped as given in the riches of its relations, in a form that can be both dispersed and collected beyond and for any further relations, and ultimately as its entire significance may proceed to be shaped in and from its triple relationality. The relational thus encompasses and enriches the participatory, extending in a lateral excess that may ever diagonally return as to its source. And yet in its more complete and specific sense, it may also speak of the gift in Christ of relations that are shared by God for God, released by the surplus relationality of the Spirit, and from the sacrifice of the cross through all the revelatory and creative poetics of the Church. New Trinitarian Ontologies names this creative response to the pivotal collapse of modern formal ontologies. Its novelty arises from both a recovery and a renewal of metaphysical speculation that proceeds from the highest ground of the Trinity. It begins with what seems the simplest and richest of philosophical questions. It asks the simplest question of what is being, as it may yet be answered in faith with the absolute question of what is God. And it speaks with Aristotle of what simply is, so as to speak with Augustine of the creative cause of all being. The electrical circuit of these originary questions may afterwards exceed any naive belief that is held from its first beginning. This surprise calls us to rethink how we should speak of what simply is, as ultimately of God as Trinity. First, it calls for a counter-narrative elision and supersession of all anti-Trinitarian secular and formal ontologies, which so far in both analytic and cognitive philosophies have refused the call of the gospel to make all things new. Second, in assuming these innovations, it discovers new ways not only to express a dead formula of Trinitarian doctrine, but in a new way that will be as fresh as it is interesting, to ask again the original questions that had once been answered by calling upon the name of the Trinity. Third, it prepares the stage for a new rhetoric of the Trinity that can speak of and write of the Trinity with a voice that is not ashamed of, but even revels in the contest of modern thought. In contrast to the dogmatic reassertions of Christian beliefs that have lost their credibility, it does not retreat from the contest of modern philosophy, but rather, like Socrates against the ancient Greek sophists, turns the deceitful arts of persuasion against his opponents, so as, in a more agile, because more offensive stance, to overcome its adversaries. We can, with this chorus of theological voices, thus begin to recollect the main currents of modern counter-ontologies, so as to explore how we could again speak of God as God speaks, in and from the creative source of all that is ever new. With a chorus of voices, we can begin to claim the weapons of the secular to disarm the unstable constitutions of these counter and anti-Trinitarian ontologies that would silence the call of the gospel and which would not allow us to rethink and yet even to relive the call of the Trinity. Absent of hope, the challenge of the secular would appear almost insurpassable. The signature challenge of Christianity after the visible collapse of Christendom has been characterized as atheism, modernism, and indifferentism, or in the more fitting words of Pope Benedict XVI, as a dictatorship of relativism. As pneumatic as it often seems, the essence of this pervasive doubt can perhaps be captured by a deliberate withdrawal from philosophical speculation of universal and objective reason to a private concern for increasingly punctiliar expressions of belief and desire. What it seems matters for us is not whether a theory of God or the world would be scientifically true, but rather, and more particularly, whether it happens to align with a previously confected ensemble of social procedures that have been designed to enable our perpetual satisfaction. If, as we see so often written across the streets of Rome, the pivotal challenge for the West in the last century had been to overthrow the physical dominion of national empires, the great contest of our century will be, in a no less cataclysmic way, to overthrow the spiritual dominion of an acephalous or headless empire of cybernetically administrated and intoxicating consumption without return. In this titanic elevation of the will over reason, the theological has now been so thoroughly subordinated to the political that it has lost its prophetic voice and can only be heard when it echoes these same ruling sentiments. Even so, the city of Rome gives everlasting witness to the hidden strength that abides within the human spirit to overthrow all heretical enemies. As a meteor that falls to earth from heaven remains for a while hot to touch, yet thereafter cools and can never again be returned to its highest and oldest home, so too we find that ideas that had once burst aflame with the light of novelty swiftly begin to lose their original and uncanny glow before their celestial metals are cast into tools which no longer surprise but even bore us. So long, however, as this stone is still hot, we can still ask the most original questions, not only of how we know, but what there is to be known, of the order of being qua being, that is, of metaphysics. As the British idealist philosopher Francis Herbert Bradley once remarked, metaphysics would be worthless only when the sense of mystery and enchantment no longer draws the mind to wander aimlessly and to love it knows not what, when in short, twilight has lost its charm. Before we close our eyes to this seeming cultural paralysis, we should take a look backwards and even leap again before its fading light. To name the Trinity today is to call upon the novelty of the Incarnation. The speculative theological movement known as Trinitarian Ontology calls for such a critical theological reconstruction of ontology, in which the structure of being in relation to being, or ontology, is radically shaped by its participation in the economic processions of the Holy Trinity. With roots as deep as Origin of Alexandria, Gregory of Nyssa, and Maximus the Confessor, this radical Trinitarian reformulation of ontology had been introduced into German theology by the Bishop of Aachen, Klaus Himmerl, in his letter to Hans Urs von Balthasar, advanced in Italian theology by Piero Coda and Professor Giulio Maspero, and following the advance of Rowan Williams, John Milbank, and the Cambridge School of Radical Orthodoxy, announced to an English and international theological audience at the September 2019 New Trinitarian Ontologies Conference, held at the University of Cambridge. As I'm pleased to report, the papers that were presented at this conference are currently being prepared for publication in 2 volumes, edited by myself, Jonathan Leonhardt, and John Milbank. Since this announcement, Trinitarian Ontology has elicited 3 major lines of criticism. First, the Heideggerian or Barthian skepticism towards the task of constructing an ontology or metaphysics that shares in participation with the processual relations of the Trinity. Second, a neo-scholastic retrenchment that resists its speculative advance as anything more than a retrograde deviation from the reconstructed consensus of the Church Fathers and the medieval scholastics. And third, a romantic idealist attempt to dialectically quarantine this advance as a virtual consequence of a prior and suspended epoch of Trinitarian speculation. With this lecture, I wish to address these latter 2 lines of criticism, especially as these are echoed in theological objections that can be heard in the works of Thomas Joseph White and John Betz. Before, however, we can turn our eyes to heaven and look again for the lost charm of metaphysics, we must address our more fashionable despisers. And I've removed a brief genealogy of where that objection comes from, and I'll continue. The wager of Trinitarian Ontology will be that all such objections have been historically misplaced. Following the Catholic Enlightenment, Nouvelle Theologie, and Radical Orthodoxy, it seeks to out-narrate its critics by recollecting the genealogical conditions not only for the submergence, but ultimately for the renewal of Trinitarian speculation. It thus calls for a bolder style of thinking to surpass the conditions of skeptical criticism. First, because the Kantian analysis of forms in abstraction from content must proceed in an infinite and productive circuit to emerge from content. Second, because the deconstruction of ontology pivots upon the subverting cycle of a counter-ontology that can itself only be dialectically abolished by a self-deconstructing critique from nowhere that would terminate its own destructive potential. And third, because all such revelatory narratives, both mainstream and marginal, are already mythical, figured, and creatively reinterpreted in modes of resistance to anti-Trinitarian, imperial, and liberal ways of dominating the world that remains haunted by the specter of metaphysics. As, although undoubtedly political in practice, theories of the Trinity can be evaluated according to their speculative coherence before any consideration of their social manifestations. In each instance, Trinitarian ontology promises more than what its critics might imagine. The procession of the Son from the Father, the Spirit from the Father and the Son, and the recycling each for the other escapes the closed loop that could be upheld as one over many, or as the abject pole of the many below the one. So long then as the love of God carries these processions of the Spirit that is shared with us, we can accept no ultimate limit upon our free speculation to know and love God as Trinity. With this cry from the wilderness, we can now explore these latter lines of criticism, which are perhaps best represented today in the recent works of Father Thomas Joseph White and Professor John Betz. As many of you will no doubt be well aware, Professor White and Professor Betz have long been celebrated as among the most brilliant lights in contemporary Catholic theology. Both hold distinguished chairs at the heights of academic Catholic theology. Father White is, as is well known here in Rome, the rector of the Pontifical University of St. Thomas, the center in Rome of Dominican studies. And Professor John Betz is a professor of systematic theology at the University of Notre Dame, the leading faculty of Catholic theology in the United States of America. And both have, along with Professor Giulio Maspero, contributed papers to the 2019 New Trinitarian Ontologies Conference held in Cambridge, England. In the years since this conference, Father White and Professor Betz have written 2 magisterial works on Trinitarian theology and Christological metaphysics. Professor Betz, these works are the Trinity on the nature and mystery of the one God, and Christ the Logos of creation, an essay in analogical metaphysics. Each of these works presents a post-Hegelian and post-Heideggerian reconstruction of ontology centered on Christ and circulating through the Trinity. Although the expression Trinitarian Ontology is seldom used in these works, each can nevertheless be read as a creative response to the shared task of renewing for theology the sources of Trinitarian speculation. Yet with clearly distinct vision, each appears to express certain reservations to Trinitarian ontology. For White, a neo-scholastic consensus of the Church Fathers with Thomistic theology is advanced to supersede modern constructions of epistemology and ontology, along with the postmodern collapse of the proper boundary between faith and reason. For Betz, a German Romantic lineage of modern Catholic theologians from Erich Schurara is championed against both Heidegger and Barth to renovate the medieval scholastic analogy of being, or analogia entis, as the crucial way for coming to know of the Trinity. Yet for both, the novelty of the Trinity seems to reside less in the hypostatic source of the Trinity itself, and more in the way that it can be approached in the disputation of long-defeated alternatives, or in the dialectic analogy that would open up from within its middle to surpass both its critics and its counterfeiters. Following Professor Julia Maspero, I wish by contrast to recommend a more relational vision of ontology, in which the novelty of the Trinity can be heard in the call to know not only what is not false, but why it once and should be regarded today as true. Thomas Joseph White introduces his book, The Trinity on the Nature and Mystery of the One God, as a, quote, Thomistic work of Trinitarian theology, and a work of Thomistic resource model, in continual conversation with modern theology. Against modern critics of Thomas Aquinas, ostensibly priority of the oneness before the threeness of God, he argues that this priority of the de uno ut uno, de deo ut uno, that God is one, to the de deo ut trino, that God is three, can be defended as, quote, some names are given to the Trinity in virtue of the unity of the divine essence, and others in virtue of the distinction of the persons. This reflexive differentiation of one is to be sustained by a relationalist account of the subsistent relations of the Trinity, in which each of the persons is wholly relative to the other, in virtue of the processions by relations of mutual opposition, end quote. Following the method of the medieval disputatio, Wright argues that Thomas Aquinas can thus be situated at the, quote, conceptual middle between two extremes, end quote, the Franciscan tradition of univocal discourse and the nominalist tradition of equivocal discourse. Against univocity, he argues that if God generates the logos by natural activity, then the immanent processions of the Trinity would, quote, develop in and through the economy. And against equivocity, he argues that if this immanent Trinity is held, quote, prior to the economy, apart from analogy, then it would again collapse into an historically constituted economy. Whether in free divine acts or in the unfolding of history, univocal and equivocal discourse would collapse the immanent processions of the Trinity into a series of economic manifestations, would collapse the distance between God and the world, would collapse God and creation. This collapse of the immanent into the economic Trinity then results in a refusal of the priority of the oneness of God, of the theology of the divine nature, and of a relational differentiation of the divine essence. Since, however, quote, the life of God is infinite, it cannot be characterized by a series of finite developmental stages of perfection or by moral evolution through his engagement with the economy, end quote, but must be, quote, able to present within and unto all that is omnipresent to the history of creation, end quote. As the Trinity is the source and structure of being, Wright recommends a post-Hegelian Trinitarian ontology, yet he repeatedly calls upon, as he argues, the historicity of this concept in the development of Christian doctrine of the Trinity absolutely as its central revelatory nova of Christ on the cross. Without a theology of the divine nature, White argues that there can be no Trinitarian theology of the divine persons. For the divine persons are, quote, truly relative to one another in all they are as subsisting relations, end quote. He develops a dialectical argument against these transitive processions of the economic Trinity. Against modern Protestant, continental, and analytic theology, he argues that, quote, in neither the second nor the third way can we attain to the immanent life of the Trinity, end quote. Rather, in each case, the revelatory nova of Scripture has been replaced by philosophical speculation, either of the supposed divinity of the creative act or of an extrinsic syntactic form of algebraic and transitive relations, as we find, for instance, in the mathematical logic of analytic philosophy. In elevating the immanent Trinity beyond the historicality of the concept, he upholds, quote, the distinction of the eternal processions and temporal missions as the key to a theology of the divine economy, end quote. For although the, quote, temporal missions of the Son and the Spirit manifest the eternal processions of the Trinitarian life, end quote, the missions do not constitute the eternal processions, nor do they enrich or transform them, end quote. Consequently, the divine economy, quote, occurs as subsequent to the mystery of God, who is, as he says, pre-constituted as Trinitarian from all eternity and unto all eternity, and whose life can encompass all events in time, end quote. He writes, quote, it follows, therefore, that there really is no such thing as the economic trinity. That is to say, a trinity that undergoes development through history of shared life with creatures, end quote. Since therefore the temporal missions of the divine persons manifest the eternal processions, White concludes that, quote, there really is no such thing as the economic trinity in which the economic trinity stands apart from its hypostatic source. White thus renders the economic processions as visible manifestations of the immanent trinity. He both formally distinguishes the immanent from the economic model of the trinity, even as he ultimately denies any real distinction between the immanent and the economic trinity. Following the influence of Augustine and Pseudo-Dionysius, White describes this virtual production of a simulated economic from the immanent processions of the Trinity as a plenitude of divine gratuity. Quote, the economic revelation of the Trinity always bears the imprint of the immanent Trinity, manifesting both the real distinction and the real unity of the three persons, end quote. Their derived existence is itself a testimony to the gift of being, which stems ultimately from the divine paternity. Yet this excessive positivity serves more effectively to conceal its hidden negativity, whether it be in the forms of epistemic access of its dialectical arguments or the way in logic by which it would come to be known. We can, however, argue at precisely this point that White appears to have rendered the economic trinity as both something essential and as accidental to the immanent processions of the divine essence. For if, as White maintains, the economic trinity both is and is not, except as it has eternally been created from the immanent trinity, then the economy of the created world, its temporality and its historicality, must be held in a paradoxical transit, in which, under the aspect of economy, there really is no economic trinity, even as, from the immanent processions of the Trinity, the economic trinity is not of itself, but only virtually produced as a simulated manifestation of its immanent processions. That is, the economy by which we come to know of God is always a virtual manifestation of the way by which God has created the world, and yet nothing unto itself. White's Trinitarian Ontology is thus centered on the essentially mediated proportions of analogy, of apophatic negation, and of these dialectical arguments by which it would come to be known, such that, however, the negativity of dialectic is systematically concealed, as it has also been suppressed under the plenitude of this revelatory grace. The goal of his book, Christ the Logos of Creation, is, as John Betz writes, quote, not just to see what the analogical metaphysics can bring to Christian theology, but also to see what happens to analogical metaphysics in light of Christian revelation. In a statement of his most daring thesis, Betz affirms that analogy is ketology. Ketology is the logia, reason, or study of the kenosis. He thus describes the metaphysics of the analogy of being, or analogical metaphysics, as a anokaptological metaphysics. Yet he insists that this, quote, fully Christological metaphysics of kenosis, quote, does not entail the end of analogical metaphysics in the sense of eternal negation, but rather essentially the end in the sense of a culminating perfection. Betz describes the beautiful procession of the Son from the Father as a giving of all that is the Father to the Son. The Father, quote, expresses himself by denying himself, as he, quote, communicates the fullness of the divine essence by simultaneously withdrawing into it. This humility of being is to be the primal standing and primal origin, not only of the Son, but of being whatsoever, in a recognizably Christological and Trinitarian ontology. The love of God surpasses the conditions of the knowledge of being, since the essence of love is to exist, and the gift of being, or act of existence, is also an act of love. The existence of the world is a gift, economically of the Son, and immanently from the Son. Against Balthasar, Betz denies what he describes as a Trinitarian inversion, where the logical priority of the Son to the Spirit in the immanent Trinity is the reverse in the historical priority of the Son to the Spirit in the economic Trinity, that is, in the historical order of salvation history. With this Trinitarian ontology, Betz outlines a, quote, new understanding of the analogy of being, end quote. Although he writes, quote, it would be too daring to say that reflection on analogy leads directly into the heart of the Trinity or Trinitarian theology, There is an analogy here which may not be evident from reason alone, but is certainly evident in the light of revelation, which transforms our entire understanding of analogy, end quote. Yet in contrast to the Thomistic actus ascendi or active being, he describes how, quote, our inmost being is analogous to the self-communication of the Father's own life in the Logos, end quote. Since therefore our own creation is through the Logos, and the Father holds nothing back from the Son, just as the Son gives everything back in the Spirit, which is an eternal Eucharist, Betz concludes that creation must be a similarly total self-communication of gift, whose completion is first consummated in Christ. This catalological reformulation of analogy thereafter can be held to reverse the maior dissimilitudo, that is, the ever greater difference of God from creation. Betz acknowledges, yes, inasmuch as through the incarnation God assumes human nature, yet even with this Christological reversal, he sustains the ever greater difference of analogy. For he writes, quote, the hypostatic union is precisely a union not of an identity of natures, it is also the union of different natures that makes the hypostatic union so stupendous, end quote. Betz thus outlines a Trinitarian ontology. The Father's essence is simply to exist. The essence of the Father exists in the Son and Logos, and yet our existence is a gift of the Holy Spirit. Hence, existence is a Trinitarian gift from the Father in the Son and of the Spirit. He develops a dialectical argument for this metaphysics of analogy. Against the univocity of being, the difference between being and becoming is that between creature and creator. And against the equivocity of being, this difference of creatures from creator remains, as he says, natively related to the Logos as the, quote, filial archetype of our own existence, end quote. As reason perceives and faith confirms, the analogy entis, or analogy of being, is for John Betz, as for Pseudo-Dionysius, the belief that, quote, God is at once in creation and as the source of all being, and beyond it as the giver of being, end quote, such that God's immanence is being, that is a gift of God's transcendence, which is beyond being. Without the analogy entis, Betz contends, there can be no Christology at all. For the maior dissimilitudo, that is the ever-greater difference of creatures from their creator, must be presupposed by the incarnation of a divine nature and of a human nature in one person. Analogy is for Betz the figure of this death or destruction of the self-enclosed and immanent certainty of reason, as in its absolute reflectivity it stands open to the transcendent, that is, ultimately to the divine Logos and to a vision of the Trinity. However, Betz also acknowledges a dialectical aporia in his position when he writes, quote, every conception of divine identity in which all difference resolves into complete indifference, where the, quote, identity of essence and existence would mean the same thing. To pass through the fire of dialectical critique would be to uphold this identity, not as a static identity of analytic ontology, which we find, for instance, in Leibniz, Frege, and analytic theology, but rather as the dynamic identity of the Trinity itself, the dynamic identity that proceeds from the unity of the divine essence and existence. In this Trinitarian logic, the way in which God the Father shines in the active existence from the divine Logos is the source of the inner dynamism of the notion of identity itself. That is what Betz calls the unity of identity in difference, which we find expressed most fully in the analogy of being or the analogy entis, such that analogy is not only grammatical, but even canonic or catalological. Against the neo-Chalcedonian reduction of the analogy of being to Christology or to the hypostatic union of Christ, Betz argues that, quote, it is precisely in the dazzling darkness of the cross that the ever greater God of the analogy entis is most revealed. The analogy of being is thus shown in the analogy of fides, that is centered on the cross and ultimately on the Christian story by which the Logos becomes flesh incarnate within the world. In the anticipatory order of knowing, quote, the philosophical analogy retains legitimacy from any effort of theological supersession within a final analogy. Analogy is thus meant to be fulfilled through the processual relations of the Trinity. For as Betz concludes, analogy, quote, fulfilled from above, is fulfilled in the anokatologos of theology, in which the Logos is love, and this love is that of God's Trinity. In his recent article, What is New in Trinitarian Theology, John Betz has observed that what is, quote, most distinctive to the new Trinitarian Ontology is Klaus Himmel's reflection on the hidden canonic aspect of language, which, quote, qualifies our understanding of the analogy entis, such that, as for Ershirara, the divine identity of essence and existence can now be understood as the eternal self-giving of the Father to the Son, whereby the divine essence eternally exists. In answer to the question of what exactly is new in Trinitarian ontology, he answers, quote, in some sense nothing, but in another sense everything, end quote. The Trinity, the threefold mystery of God, is, for Klaus Himmerl, elevated as the principle of revelation, erupting from below as the ground of being, even as, from the gift of love, it is transformed in every thought. As the procession of the Son from the Father is equally an expression of the Spirit, of the love of the Son for the Father, and altogether the creation of the world is a gift of every act of being, the way in which we speak of being must be a gift. In reading being as gift, Klaus Himmerl can be radically contrasted with Martin Heidegger, for where in Heidegger the analytic of Dasein begins in reflection so as to be constituted by care that passes away before death, for Himmerl, any such analysis of being is carried along from the beginning in and from the concrete principle of creation, even in every act of reflection. Since, however, the care of being towards death is more originally constituted in the gift of love, that is shown in its victory over death, the, quote, ultimate irony of Heidegger's philosophy is, for Betz, that, quote, it finally leads us right back to theology, end quote. This disclosure of enclosedness of Dasein can accordingly be reconceived canonically, not as, quote, being empties itself, end quote, from a hidden and secular ground, but rather as, quote, being is self-emptying, that is, being is a canonic gift from a higher creative source, and in this way, ontology is ketology, that is, an analogical metaphysics, in which the relation of being to beings always opens up in beyond itself to the creative giver of being. And since this self-emptying of being is principally expressed in the mire dissimilitudo between God and creation, and formulated in the essentially proportioned grammar of analogy, Himmerl can rightly say that the emptying of God in Christ, quote, grounds the analogy intis, end quote. The theological grammar of being and the way in which we speak of as spoken through the Logos and the Spirit, which circulates in and from as it is spoken from God as Trinity. Following this inspiration of the Bishop of Aachen, we can now recommend a more relational vision of the Trinity, since the simple unity of the Trinity is constituted by the essential relations of the divine persons. Creation is the work in concert of the whole Trinity, and an effect resembles its cause. The structure of being or ontology must share in a participation with the subsistent relations that spiral out from as created by God as Trinity. Since further, the way that creatures know resembles the way that God has made the world to make himself known, even as he knows all who know in a perfect reciprocity of absolute knowing, the way of the economic Trinity to know of God must be pre-constituted from its principal source in the innate Trinity. And since finally logic is the art of scientific knowing, and there can be no dialectical argument, whether to analogy or to the Trinity, except as logic is grounded in the divine Logos, communicated by the Son of God, and as such, constituted in the divine essence, the way in which we come to know God is also shown to us from the divine essence of God as Trinity in such a way that it is Trinitarian. This Trinitarian logic could thus authorize a critical response to various forms of resistance to Trinitarian speculation today. In contrast to White, the way of economic Trinity to know of God cannot be regarded as a merely virtual remainder of the visible manifestations of the immanent Trinity. And in contrast to Betz, the indifferent unity of the divine essence and existence in which our way of knowing opens up in the ultimate theological analogy cannot remain closed to further dialectical analysis of its internally mediated and differentiated relations. For in each case, the positive objectivity of God, the Trinity, and the analogy of being would seem to paradoxically both suppress and also virtually rely for its analytical validity upon the negative differentiation of simulated forms of logic, dialectic, and grammar. So long, however, as the subjective relations of the intellect are refused a place within the metaphysics of analogy, no royal avenue can be found in philosophical science to return from the whirling sea of doubt to the fire and heart of Trinitarian speculation. We can, in response to these critics, begin to defend the novelty of Trinitarian ontology by more radically upholding the Trinity as the revelatory source of its own novelty, the newness of theology, and indeed all that is ever new. For in light of the gospel, what makes something new must also be thought of in a new way. It is not an event from nothing, but rather an event that shows even this sense of nothing to have always been something, even, we may say, a singularity that makes it possible for something to be rather than nothing at all. It is as new as it is old, from the oldest source of all that has become and will ever be new, an originary creation of all that can be recreated, and in the circuit of becoming equally the being or substance that upholds the ground from which even the unsurpassable rupture of the cross can be celebrated as the passing of the way of the old that heralds the coming of the new. The story of the gospel is our story. Hence, as the ending of the Gospel of John relates, if all Jesus had done were to be written down, quote, even the world itself could not contain the books that should be written. With this approach, what Himmerl had described as, quote, a Trinitarian moment, that is one more reminiscent of the baptism of Jesus on the River Jordan, as the old world of a promise refused passes away, even as the breath of the redeeming Spirit fills a child of an age to come with life undaunted. Rather than embracing the false doctrine of promise, of technology as ontology, and ultimately of the cybernetics as absolute, we should instead look inward to rediscover, quote, the real progress and real self-fulfillment, in which, quote, begins when one gets over oneself and leaves oneself behind, end quote. We should instead heed, with Klaus Himmerl, the, quote, call to return to the gospel and hear anew the promise of Christ, end quote. Behold, I make all things new. The new is never held fixed under the necessary forms of the past, because even the past holds the springs of all that has become and will ever come to be. New Trinitarian Ontologies names this creative response to the pivotal collapse of modern formal ontologies. It speaks of the structure of being as it has been spoken in creation and known in every creative response of the divine logos. It affirms the participation, or methexis, of being proceeding in and from the first principles of the Christian and Holy Trinity. With this affirmation of a participatory imagining, it announces a strategic reversal of any secular privileging of the ontological over and apart from the theological. It may thus speak both before and after the speculative impasse of modern philosophy. It attempts instead to navigate between an abject skepticism that would sunder the theological from the ontological, and any ready-made dogmatism that would regiment all theological answers in advance. If, however, this recycling of ready-made answers to searching questions often bores us, it is not because it is too new, but rather and only because we have become more weary of it. The mythic past remains for us to be rediscovered. As the French poet Charles Bigot writes, quote, Homer is new and fresh this morning, and nothing perhaps is so old and tired as today's newspaper. And as in the words of Gustav Mahler, quote, tradition is not the worship of ashes, but the preservation of fire, end quote. If the leaders of the world today have lost sight of this, the task remains for us to rediscover it. The ways of life that had been rejected by our parents have now recommended a way to surpass their failures. And as we hear more and more of today, it is not the old but the young who most of all desire to rediscover a new way through the past in search of a brighter future. To be religious today is to be strange, to summon forces unheard of, and perhaps even to embody them. If we dare to know, we must ask the central questions of Christianity, of the Trinity, and of its ontology in a new way. We must not merely draw all that is past to the present, but must more radically leap over the entire forgetfulness of our past that is present so that we might found a new beginning.